'Twas the eve before Runenburg Eve. That's right, the Dwarves of Runenburg DLC for the last spell is coming out on Wednesday, and the developer has released their final weapon preview today, this morning specifically, and I'm going to be diving into everything we know about the weapons of the Dwarves of Runenburg DLC. First and foremost, Wednesday is the DLC launch, and we will be live here on YouTube and also over on Twitch if you want to swing by and check out our first impressions. There are 4 things that we know we're getting with this DLC. There are the dwarves themselves, the new map titled Runenburg, and then also trinket perks. Perks on trinkets, I think is the better way to say that. And then last but not least, we have weapons. If you're curious about any of the first 3 of those, I have already made a video titled Tossin Dwarves, the last spell DLC preview that you can check out with information about everything that we knew about a week ago, I think. But today we're only talking about weapons. As a bit of a disclaimer, things have changed radically, it seems, even since their first preview that they released or the video that they released as part of the III initiative. Things are changing behind the scenes. It seems like the overheat mechanic on the cannon, for instance, has changed, but we'll dive into all of that in a second. But the disclaimer is simply take all of this with a grain of salt. This is still, it appears, in development. They're still tweaking things. They're still doing balance changes. So what we will get on Wednesday, we are not entirely sure, but that's not going to stop us from doing some speculation. So the first thing we need to talk about are the 3 weapons. We have the Gauntlet, the War Shield, and the Cannon. The Gauntlet is described as a magical weapon that morphs from close range to a long-range weapon when a certain threshold is reached. Changing your approach to the battlefield, lift the rocks, kill your enemies, and reposition yourself to take advantage of its unique passive. The War Shield is a melee weapon designed to tank damage before letting you unleash your power as retaliation. Built by the dwarves, available to everyone. Brace yourself, resist the monster's assault, and when it's your turn, clean the battlefield with a handful of destructive skills. You're not the pacifist hero they think you are. And then the cannon is a simple ranged weapon, yet filled with enormous firepower. It could easily be in talks for a weapon of mass destruction title, but such a destructive tool should always come at a price. Thus, the cannon demands careful resource management, or it might lead you to dire consequences. So we're going to talk about all 3 of these weapons in that order, and the place to begin is the Gauntlet. So what we know about the Gauntlet is that it is a one-handed magic weapon. It has 3 skills. We're going to go into each skill in particular because we have a little animation to highlight how each of them works. But the 3 are Snap, which is kind of like the old school Shocking Touch. It hits in a T shape. We have Shockwave, which is a propagate skill early in the skill order. We're hoping that it's going to have multiple uses, and we don't know much more about it than that. And then we have Geocannon, which is a large point-blank AoE. But the weapon perk, Reservoir, allows you to empower your weapon every 6 targets that you hit, which means that large point-blank AoE on Geocannon presumably can target things further away. So let's go through these skills and look at each of them. First, we have to talk about the perk itself, Reservoir. The way that they describe it is accumulate the runic energy in your gauntlet and release it in a spell, enhancing its range and power. To use Reservoir, first you'll need to hit up to 6 enemies to charge it. If you're lucky or insanely good, and you hit 6 enemies with only 1 skill, you're ready to go to the next step. Once your Reservoir is up and ready, use your much improved range to punish enemies that were too far away from you just a minute ago. So they show you a before and after of the attacks from the Gauntlet. But the things that I can glean from these 2 animations are the follows. First of all, Reservoir appears to be a binary state. You gain it after you hit 6 targets, which doesn't seem that hard because your base propagate attack, that second attack, hits 4 by default. So I don't think you have to be that lucky if you get 2 propagation bounces to pretty reliably hit 6 targets. We don't know if those 6 targets have to be unique though. So it's possible that if your propagate doubled back on itself, you're not going to be able to activate Geo Reservoir. We'll have to see. But like I said, it's gained by hitting 6 targets. It increases your damage and skill range. This is very, very back of the envelope math, but based on the numbers that we're seeing in the animation, I'm guessing you maybe get a 50% damage increase when it's active. We don't know if that's 50% total damage or 50% regular damage. And then the propagation skill at least goes from a range of 1 to a range of 6. So that's a +5 skill range bonus. And the other thing of note that we don't know one way or the other is both of the propagation attacks in the Geo Reservoir example dead end. I don't have any reason to believe that Geo Reservoir will increase the number of propagation bounces, but it would be kind of cool if it did, and we can't find out any information from the animation. So now on to the skills. The first skill that we have is Snap. Extract a stalagmite from the ground to pierce your target. Taking advantage of opportunism, simultaneously smaller stalagmites will hit the enemies behind your target. This has a T-shape attack, just like the old Shocking Touch on the Scepter. It definitely can be used to build Geo Reservoir, although it will never build Geo Reservoir in a single attack because it hits a maximum of 4. 1 primary hit on the front and then 3 secondary hits behind it. It does appear to have an opportunism modifier, which makes it very interesting to say pair with other opportunism weapons. Like maybe we're going to see some Gauntlet axe type of builds, those types of things. And then other than that, the range appears to be 3. And we don't know if that is range modifiable outside of Geo Reservoir. It is possible for this weapon that all of the attacks are locked at range 1, but then you get the additional range from Geo Reservoir when you activate it, and you can't get range any other way. We'll have to wait and see, but as it stands, we have a range of 3 on this one. Next, we have Shockwave. Project a shockwave of stalactites to nearby enemies, shattering their armor. This is an AoE skill scaling on propagation. So what do we know about it? We know that it has a propagate that hits 4 targets. It has a debuff that appears to be an armor shred. They refer to it as shattering their armor. So I'm guessing that that's some type of static armor reduction that presumably happens before the actual damage is applied from the skill. Otherwise, it would be kind of weird. And then in the screenshot here, it does appear to use mana, which if you've watched the channel at all, you know that I was really hoping we would get a no mana propagation attack, but this may or may not be it. Like I said, things are changing behind the scenes. We don't really know how any of these are exactly going to work out, and they don't mention mana anywhere explicitly here. I'm also hoping we get more than one use of this. Most of the propagate attacks that we have, I wouldn't say most, some of the propagate attacks that we have are single use, the hand crossbows blaze being maybe the only example. I guess Tome of Secrets also. But it would be nice to be able to use Shockwave a handful of times. So that's, my fingers are crossed on that one. Next, we have Geocannon. Extract 3 gigantic rocks and throw them in front of you. A powerful attack, but easily dodged by faster enemies. So it hits a 3x4 rectangle, apparently directly in front of you. It's another point blank skill. It has inaccurate 3x on it, which I think is the largest inaccurate we've ever seen by a long shot. So that's kind of Geocannon's Achilles heel, as it were. It's definitely range modifiable with Reservoir, but we have no idea if regular skill range is going to affect the Gauntlet. And then last but not least, the only other thing that we can see here is that the hero gained 2 movement. I am guessing that this is movement that's gained through head-on and not movement that comes from the ability. I'm basing that on the fact that the hero appears to have no movement, and then after using it, they have 2. And as we know, head-on has a low threshold of movement to activate. But anyways, the main things that we know is it is a very large AoE. It is a highly inaccurate AoE. It's going to really punish you for low accuracy, especially against dodgy enemies. And it looks like it hits reasonably hard. So interesting toolkit that the Gauntlet has, but now we need to move on to the War Shield. So the War Shield is a two-handed melee weapon. It has 4 abilities, like all two-handed weapons. It has Breach, which is a primary 5-target AoE. It makes a little U in front of you. We have Shield Up, which is a single target attack that also grants block. We have Moving Wall, which is a orthogonal mobility skill that does 2 tiers of damage to the front 3 enemies when you arrive and the 3 enemies behind them. And then we have Wall of Pain, which appears to be Scorching Wave out the front and the back. Not necessarily modified by opportunism, though that would be lovely. And the weapon perk here is Perfect Guard, which is the more you get hit, the stronger you get, scaling your total damage. So let's talk about Perfect Guard first. So their description of Perfect Guard is get revenge from your enemies with Perfect Guard. The more you get hit, the higher your damage will be on the next turn. However, this increased power will gradually decrease with each subsequent skill you use. Additionally, avoiding damage during the turn will halve your current bonus. So from the previous preview, we got a little glimpse of what Perfect Guard's tooltip was at the time, and it was a total damage increase of 6% per hit that you got hit by, up to a total of 60%, and then every action point you spent was a minus 3% decrease, and if you did not get hit by a turn, your total damage bonus from this would be halved. But let's take a look at what we can figure out from here. Like I said before, it appears to be a 6% increase. That seems to track here as well. Maximum of 60%, causing AP uses using AP causes it to reduce. Not taking a hit apparently halves it, and it appears to reset at the end of each night. So each turn it can stack up, and then it will reduce at the end of the night. Perfect Guard seems pretty interesting. It's potentially meta-defining. I'll talk about that a little more towards the end, but for your really big heavy hitters, having another source of total damage coming from anywhere is potentially quite impactful. But on to the skills. The first skill that we have is Breach. Smash down the shield to crush the monsters in front of you, inflict pain for a limited cost. It hits in a frontal point-blank AoE in front of you in a little U, so it's hitting the enemies directly to your right and to your left, or the walls if you happen to be standing in a gate. It does not appear to have any debuff on it, and they use the term limited cost, which I think is very interesting. If you've watched much of my play, I don't love two-handed weapons when their primary attack costs 2 AP. I think it would be incredible if Breach only cost 1 AP. Like a 5-target 1 AP attack would be pretty shocking, but the fact that they called out limited cost makes me wonder. So we'll have to wait and see. Then we have Shield Up. Prepare yourself for the impending assault and strike your target to gain block. Simple as that. It is a single target hit, and it adds block to your hero. In this example, we don't know what level of shield this is, but it's adding 8 block. If you've played much with block, you know that especially in early nights, block can be the best survivability stat by a mile. So the idea that you're getting block basically for free off of having a shield could be very powerful in the early game. You might be able to pick up one of these war shields and be relatively galvanized against basically anything killing you for the duration. We also don't know how many uses you get of skill up, but if you get a couple of uses, that is a lot of block, and that is going to make heroes using the war shield very, very resilient, which I know is part of the design, so it kind of makes sense. I'd be surprised if we saw more than 2 uses of shield up. And it's nice that it's also doing some damage at the same time. Next up, we have Moving Wall. Utilize this skill to reposition yourself and apply a debuff to the monsters struck by it, reducing their damage output. This is a maneuver/mobility skill. It appears to have a range of 5 tiles that could be modified by the hero's skill range. We don't know. It hits 3 across wherever you arrive, and then it hits secondarily 3 behind those 3. So essentially it is hitting a 3x2 area with primary damage on the front 3 and less damage on the second 3. And it also appears to come with a minus 20% damage down. So even the enemies that you aren't killing are going to be hit hitting for less moving forward, which I think is really interesting. Given that this is a debuff and a maneuver, I think there's a lot of interesting implications here, with this potentially being something you could use with a momentum build where you use this as one of your maneuver skills, and also then are getting the damage buff from the perk. So I think there's a lot of interesting implications here, but also the debuff means that this would be amazing to pair with, say, a one-handed axe to mow down that second tier that you didn't kill right off the bat. Moving Wall, very interesting skill. One of the skills that I think I'm most excited about. Then last but not least, we have Walls of Pain, a devastating skill in AoE to wipe all your enemies from the battlefield. The screams of your enemies can even be heard as you crush their souls. It is a 2x3 AoE that happens directly in front of you and directly behind you. It doesn't appear to have any debuff associated with it, so I think it's just going to be a hard-hitting 12-target skill, very akin to Spin to Win on the two-handed axe. Doesn't seem to have a lot of exciting stuff going on, but I could certainly imagine maneuvering into a crowd, nestling yourself into a location, and obliterating 12 enemies with this. Seems cool, good flavor, I like it. Now we need to talk about the cannon. The cannon is your two-handed ranged weapon. It is very interesting. It has 4 skills, as all two-handed weapons do. Cannonball hits 5 targets and is the primary attack, so it hits in a plus shape. Then you have Rocket Jump, which is a maneuver that does damage where you land. Then you have Mortar, which is a long-range 9-target stun, with the primary target having a high stun chance and the secondary ring having a smaller stun chance. And then you have Armageddon, which is a multi-hit AoE, the first that we've seen in the game. It hits 5 targets in an X shape around the location of the multi-hit. And the weapon perk is Overheat, which, as I mentioned, seems to have changed since whenever they previously created the marketing materials for Overheat. And now you apparently take health damage and explode a little bit when your weapon is overheating, and it overheats when you've used 7 AP. So let's dive into the weapon perk first. So here is Overheat, the price to pay to access such firepower. Each skill of the cannon will generate heat determined by the skill's cost. Upon reaching heat 7, the cannon overheats, now requiring health points to use its skills in addition to their current cost. At the end of the turn, the cannon begins to cool down, providing a brief respite. When the cannon is overheating, firing it will trigger an explosion around you, damaging everything around them, monsters and structures alike. The cannon will always survive the overheating, but your hero might not. So a couple curious things here. The cooldown mechanic is something we'll talk about in a second. In fact, let's just move on through. So like I mentioned, it used to say that the AP scaled. That was the previous design. Now it's talking about health loss. I think that's a much more interesting space, and it opens up some curious synergies. Will the cannon be a blood mage weapon? We don't know quite yet. But basically, you will overheat when you've spent 7 AP. We don't know how much the AP skill costs are for the cannon. There's a part of me that's wondering if the AP costs are going to be on average higher than we've previously seen, like maybe even seeing the first 3 AP action on the cannon. Only time will tell. The heat that is generated is going to be interesting. I have a bunch of different theories on how it may work. One possibility is that every turn it reduces. I think the more likely one, though, is that heat hangs around between turns, and only once you have entered overheating does heat start to reduce. Or it might reduce on some cadence, but we're not going to know that until further down the road. What we do know is that spending AP is going to cause overheating, and then overheating is going to cause your skills to cost heat, like you're getting burned by it, but also cause you to explode. If the explosion scales off your damage, this could be a very interesting weapon. The one thing that I will say, though, is that explosion may be hard to leverage because the cannon does not have a single range 1 ability. I don't believe. All of its abilities have minimum range associated with them, which is going to make it hard to you're going to have to be shooting something else and exploding on the things you're standing next to. But we'll get into that more as we talk about it. Let's go through the skills. So first we have Cannonball. It shoots hard. It hits in a plus symbol centered around your cursor. It does relatively large damage if all of these heroes were relatively the same level. It does have inaccuracy rings like all ranged weapons. It has a minimum range of 3 and an apparent range of 7 in this case. So there's kind of a sweet spot. It's not a super long range weapon, and it does have a relatively high minimum range, which is going to make it hard to utilize in some circumstances. That could certainly mean that it's good paired with something like a hand crossbow that's good at clearing out your immediate vicinity, and then you can rain death and destruction on the things further away. But Cannonball seems like a pretty straightforward, no debuff, no mana cost primary attack. Then we have Rocket Jump. Have you ever dreamt of flying? Jump into the melee and unleash chaos upon the monsters. So this is a mobility / maneuverability. It appears to have an 8-tile AoE impact zone. It does not appear to have a mana cost in this screenshot. Has a minimum range of 3, maximum range of 7. So that's a theme that we're seeing here. It is interestingly not orthogonal. This might be the first. No, I guess it has like stunning entrance energy in terms of its mobility maneuver thing, which might make it an interesting thing to pair with momentum heroes, since you're going to be able to get around the battlefield a lot. We don't know if it's subject to weapon range or skill range. I would assume it probably is, but its inaccuracy is definitely impacted by the same range skill weapons rings that we usually see. Rocket Jump seems pretty interesting. The thing that I will say about Rocket Jump is the damage on it is probably relatively incidental, because once you arrive where you're going, you're going to have to rely on another weapon to do the rest of the work, because as we mentioned before, you can't actually shoot things that you're standing next to with the cannon. Then we have Mortar, a long-distance skill to slow down the horde. It has a high chance to stun the primary target and a lower chance to stun the surrounding monsters. It's got two-handed hammer 2.0 vibes. It hits 9 targets just like the hammer. Again, its minimum range, or in this case, its minimum range is 7, which is vaguely insane. So you can only stun things that are far, far away. It does cost mana, and the primary and secondary have different levels of stun percentage. Overall, this seems like a really interesting weapon. It makes me wonder if two-handed hammer Mortar is going to be an interesting stun build moving forward. You can stun things that are far away. You can stun things that are close. I think that the secondary hit having a lower stun percentage is not a particularly big deal. It might mean that early on this is particularly useful, and then later on you can just consistently get all 9 stuns from it. That would be my expectation, unless there's some tweaks to the way that stun works. And then last but not least, probably the most interesting skill that the developers have rolled out since the early days of Blaze still being a multi-hit attack. Armageddon. Turn the air into hellfire with a very large multi-hit AoE. Probably the most powerful skill ever created by the dwarves. Maybe the most powerful skill ever created by the developers. It is a multi-hit attack. It shows 7 targets here, which is a far cry from the 13 targets that we saw in the preview. That indicates that there was definitely a change to base multi-hit, because you can only have +5 multi-hit from gear and perks, and 7 + 5 is only 12. And in the preview, they definitely showed 13 hits. So there's been some tweaking there. Each multi-hit is going to hit in an X pattern, is what we can see here. It definitely costs mana, presumably a fairly high mana cost. It appears to have a relatively low base damage, which, if we know anything about multi-hit, relatively low base damage doesn't mean anything. Cough, hand crossbow, cough. It has the min range of 3, max range of 7. So very interesting skill. Could see it being the first skill that the developers release with a 3 AP cost. Depending on how they designed it, it might even have a 4 AP cost and cause you to overheat very regularly. The cannon has an interesting design space. We just won't know until we know. But Armageddon is sure to be a crowd favorite for clearing out smaller enemies and doing some of the things that the wand does so well with multi-hit in general. I will say that the downside of overheating, the wand is probably still going to be very, very effective in the hand crossbow because they don't have the downside of overheating and can just dish out lots of multi-hits, generally speaking. So now to do a little bit of speculation. So first of all, this all looks super cool. I'm so excited to play with all the new weapons and everything new that's coming with the DLC, and hope you're there to join me. We'll shout out on that front. But in terms of thinking about these weapons, I think that the Gauntlet is going to be really interesting, but I think its defining characteristic is going to be the propagation attack. So I am hoping that two things happen. I'm hoping that it is low or no mana cost, and I am hoping that it has multiple uses. I think that's going to be very defining for that particular skill. I want a weapon that is bread and butter about propagation to kind of bring propagation into the place that the hand crossbow brings multi-hit to. I want it to be a first-class stat. Right now, I value propagation relatively low compared to multi-hit, and I would love to see that change. I also think that the Geo Reservoir damage increase is going to be a bit make or break. I think if it's damage and it's like a 50% damage mod, it's going to be good without being great. I think that if it's total damage and it's like 40% or something like that, I think that could be really, really interesting. The other piece of the Gauntlet that I'm excited about, but maybe slightly less excited about, is just seeing a better opportunism weapon show up in the magic tree. I think that the Druid Staff is very opportunism, but really more poison, and I'm super excited to see like the axe equivalent of a magic weapon showing up in the Gauntlet. Then we have the War Shield, and the War Shield has the potential to change the game in a lot of different ways. So first and foremost, it is a source of 60% total damage that did not exist before. And as we know from our work on the damage spreadsheet and all that kind of stuff, 60% total damage is a lot of total damage. And so I could imagine this being used in a lot of different places. If you get 2 charges on its mobility ability, I think it could be a great thing to pair for some unique momentum builds, right? You store up a bunch of total damage and then you do like a few big hits and you're zipping around getting momentum from your maneuver. I think could be really interesting. I also think that the War Shield has the possibility, although I think it's a bit, I'm skeptical that we could see something in the world of spiky counter bodybuilder type of, a build that is defensively minded being enabled by the War Shield. But I'm not holding my breath. I think that for a lot of reasons having to do with the number of enemies that can hit you in a given turn, et cetera, it's a bit of a stretch to imagine that defensive builds could really graduate into being first-class builds that I consider top tier. But we will have to wait and see. And I will say that early War Shields, I think, are going to be one of the stronger weapons in the game. For that first night when you roll a hero with a War Shield, I think the block is going to be fantastic. And also, it looks like the damage is pretty good. And I think it's going to give you a lot of flexibility to kind of wade into the horde before the big bads show up, the boomers, the rippers, etc. As for the cannon, AP is going to be make or break on this one. I really suspect that we're going to see some big AP numbers on skills for this one, trying to push that 7 AP cap. But I think it's going to be interesting. It has the potential to be one of those like really hard to balance weapons where it's either going to be off the charts, the most powerful thing in the world, or a total pain in the butt to use. So we'll have to wait and see about that. I think the AoE on the overheating is going to be super annoying with your own structures, because this is a very long range weapon. It doesn't really have any nearby stuff that it can do. And like rocket jump, you're not gonna be able to jump back into your town because you're also gonna be doing damage when you land. So you may have to create like landing areas for your Rocketeer if you want them to do that. But it's gonna be very interesting. I think it has the potential to synergize with a lot of multi-hit builds and synergize with a lot of stun builds. So we'll just have to wait and see how that all pans out. There's also an interesting question of, Cannon plus Blood Mage. If the AP costs are relatively low on the cannon and the limiting factor really becomes overheating and the health loss from it, Blood Mages are fantastic at regaining health, and it might mean that you can really go ham with a cannon and a Blood Mage. But all of that is going to be known soon enough. Just a couple of days from now, we'll be playing the DLC and learning all of this stuff. So, few last things. There's a ton to play with and experiment with, and we'll be starting that on Wednesday. If you want to come join us, I think it's going to be a really exciting set of streams. We're going to be going Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So there's a ton of last spell on the agenda if you are so interested. And then generally speaking, I'm curious, what do you think? Which of these weapons is going to be meta defining? Do you think any of them are going to become kind of best in class? Do you think any of them are going to birth new builds that previously didn't exist? I'd love to hear from you. And if you want to talk more about this stuff, come join the Discord. We're talking about this stuff all the time, and I'm sure with the release of Runenburg, we are going to have a ton to talk about in the Discord. But for now, that is your high-level overview of everything we know about the weapons coming in the Dwarves of Runenburg DLC. I hope to see you on stream and around, but thanks for watching. Have a good one. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.